Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Fusion 360 Live. My name is Brad Tallis. I'm from Autodesk. I've got Jason helping me out on the chat. So today's topic, we're going to be creating this heatsink that you see on the screen. This is part of that laser projector kind of thing. You can kind of see this heatsink right here holding the, I'm sorry, the camera's out of focus. Holding the laser diodes in there. Before we get started, I actually wanted to point something out. Let me bring up a web page. So we've been getting comments, we're doing a lot more live streams and people are like, oh, I'm not getting notified of when these live streams are happening. And unfortunately, YouTube is not the best for alerting you when the upcoming live streams are happening. So what I personally recommend, if you haven't already, in YouTube, do a search for Fusion 360 Live, okay? And that'll bring you to this channel right here. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, but you'll see right here, upcoming live streams. And here's a list of the upcoming live streams, and they're listed on the particular date and the particular time in your time zone. So I'm in the Mountain Time Zone, so this says 12 o'clock. Which is where we're at right now. They're doing this cam hangout, I think on Saturday, it looks like. Jason's doing his second part of his sketching live stream next week. And notice the time. And again, make sure you look at what the time says when you go to this web page, because this time will be per your time zone. So I recommend coming out here quite often. Honestly, we're adding new live streams constantly. I noticed in the chat before we started, people were asking, where's Lars? Well, guess what? On the 30th. Jason and I thought it'd be kind of fun to do a hangout where we're going to answer your questions. We'll look at the chat. We'll answer some questions. We'll kind of give you our background and stuff. And we thought it'd be fun to bring in a guest speaker. So of course we invited Lars. So you'll find out what's he doing now and all that kind of stuff. So definitely make sure you mark that one on your calendar. Now you can set these reminders, but I've personally found that they aren't very helpful. It sends you an email, and unless you're on your email constantly, you won't know. So I personally recommend putting them in your calendar, setting an alert, etc. You'll notice that we're having a lot of the ECAD types webinars in here also. And we're constantly adding more and more topics. So I recommend coming and looking at this at least once or twice a week, if not more. So, okay, let's dive in. Like I mentioned before, we're going to be creating this heatsink and then a couple of the gears. There's some small gears, and it's going to be kind of hard to see on the camera. That rotate the lenses in front of the laser. So we're gonna do basically two different topics today. We're gonna learn a little bit about this heatsink, and then we're gonna learn about some gears. Now, this heatsink isn't overly complicated, but I am gonna share some tips and tricks with you, which is kind of what I'm famous for. Different methodologies, different ways of designing things that I ran across when I was reverse engineering this model. So also in the description of the YouTube video live stream, I've included the drawings for the heatsink and for the gears. Okay, and then I've also included my outline, which I usually put an outline out there so you can kind of follow along. Now they're pretty cryptic. But I kind of highlight and bold kind of the key things, but this is what I put together as I'm designing the model. So feel free to download both of those and use them to create these parts. I love seeing what people are doing. I noticed, I'll give a shout out to Steve Sneed. He watches these live streams and posts a video or a picture out on the Fusion 360 Facebook group. And it really warms my heart to see that the work that Jason and Angelo and all those guys and myself are putting into these live streams really are paying off. So we love seeing what you guys are doing. So make sure you post those out there if you want to. So So shout out to Steve. Okay, let's dive in. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I like, and you've heard me say this multiple times, I like to start out by creating a new component. That way everything is organized underneath these components. So I'm gonna just call this one Heatsink. I mean, pretty self-explanatory. I'll say okay, and now you can see I have a component called Heatsink, okay? And again, using this drawing, so you'll notice I've kind of dimensioned certain things out and all that kind of stuff, how far things are separated, etc. So I'm going to use that to, oops, let me go to this guy, create my sketch. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to do the front plane in this case. And I like to keep things as symmetric as possible. So I'm going to start with the rectangle, and I really like this center rectangle command. And what that allows me to do is pick this 0, 0, and I'm going to create a rectangle that's 1.92 wide. Now I'll hit the tab key to switch between my height or my length. So I'll come in here and say 1.92. I'll hit the tab key again, and I can do 0.25 tall. Let's kind of zoom up on this a little bit. So again, use the tab key to jump between those. I'll do the exact same thing again. I'll create, there's another smaller rectangle, and it is 0.29. And again, I personally like to type in the length first and then the height. So 0.29 by 0.2. And notice everything is kind of centered. Okay, the next thing I want to do, so basically what I did here is I drew, and I apologize for the flashing, but it kind of you can kind of see this rectangle here, and then there's going to be a smaller rectangle in the center. Now you'll notice I didn't dimension where these circles are, and that's because we're going to let Fusion define where they are. And so, you know, as you're looking at some of my drawings, you're like, man, he's missing a ton of dimensions. I actually do that on purpose, and it's for you to follow along the outline and to follow along the video to see how powerful Fusion really is. So I purposely left dimensions off. That way you have to use the special tools. So, okay, so what I'm going to do now is create a couple circles, and I'm going to purposely create them in the wrong location. So these are 0.71, okay? So you can kind of see I can put that there. And then I'm going to draw another circle purposely in the wrong location and purposely the wrong size, okay? Now I want these to be the same size, so I'm going to use the equal constraint. I'll say I want that circle and that circle to be equal. I also want them to be horizontal with each other. So I'm going to say horizontal, vertical, and I'll click the center points of those, and you can see how this one dropped down. And now they're at the same level. So if I were to move one, the other one has to move also. Okay. Then finally, what I'm going to do is put a dimension on here. So I'm going to say from here to here, I want that to be exactly 1 inch in this case. And you can see how they move together. Now I want to put them in the correct location. So I'm going to go ahead and say tangent. And what this is going to allow me to do is I want this edge to be tangent with this edge of the smaller rectangle. So I'm going to, you can see I'm in my tangent constraint, so I'll click there, and then I'll click there, and you can see that they moved over. If I were to move down, you can see that sure enough, they're tangent, okay? However, they're still in the wrong location. Let me just drop it right there, for example. The last thing I want to do is line them up with the center. So one more time, I'll do this horizontal vertical, and I can click that point and that point there, and you'll see that they dropped down into location, and they turned from blue to black, which means that the sketch is fully constrained. Okay, so I used a couple different constraints there to help me with this design. I could have left off this 1 inch and made both of these tangent. That's totally fine. But I was kind of showing you how we started out here in space and then we kind of forced the circles to go where we wanted them to go using constraints. Okay, I've mentioned before I like to keep my sketches simple, so I'm going to leave it at this, and then I want to extrude. Now, I don't want to extrude what in my outline I call these the little wings. I don't want to extrude those. So I'm going to draw a box like so, and notice I was able to select all of the profiles using a selection window. Otherwise, I would have had to click here, control click here, control click here, probably have to zoom up a little bit, grab all of these regions, and you can see how lengthy that's taking. Well, just draw a selection box around, making sure you don't go too far, because then it would select that wing. But I'm just going to do something like that. And it allows me to select all of those profiles with 1 click. Okay, now I can right click and say extrude. We'll start to drag and we can kind of see what the profile looks like. And according to the drawing, and again, I'm not going to jump back and forth too much, but it's 1.8 in depth. And I'll say, okay. Now, like one of the other reasons I mentioned I like components is I can expand these open. And for example, I can expand open my sketches, I can expand open my bodies, and I can turn my sketch on or off at any time. I really like that flexibility. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to, hollow this thing out. Okay, and now you can kind of see why we didn't do these little wings at first, because we're going to shell this part out, and I don't want the shell to go into this little extra area right here. So we're kind of breaking it down into smaller chunks, smaller components. I'm going to click on this front face, right mouse click, and it shows me the commands that make sense. Now, Jason showed some really cool functionality in his live stream. One of the things I'm really bad at is the S key. If you hit the S key on your keyboard, you can search for particular commands. So for example, I could start typing in shell. So I type in SH, and there's the shell command. So if you're used to like typing in commands, or if you're really used to going into menus and having to look for it or whatever, that S key is a really cool shortcut, and it allows you to even run the command right from that shortcut key, that S key. So we're going to do a shell. I'm going to click that front face, and I want to select the back face. Now I've shown this, but I'm going to reiterate. If I click and hold, it allows me to probe through and grab. So it's almost like a laser pointer. So the laser would first hit this front face, and then it would hit that back face. So I can actually select both of those faces without having to rotate. And I know personally that, especially if you don't have like a 3D connection mouse or a 3D mouse, having to rotate can get pretty cumbersome if you're doing it over and over again. So I really like to probe through and select those faces without having to rotate. Okay, the thickness is going to be 0.075 according to the drawing. And I'll go ahead and say okay. And again, right here is that 0.075 kind of showing the thickness of that shell. I use the shell command all the time. I could have drawn, on my sketch, I could have drawn a couple more circles, a couple more lines, and just extruded that particular profile. But that would have taken a lot of time. And then if I wanted to change the thickness, I'd have to change multiple dimensions. I'd have to change that circle, I'd have to change that circle, I'd have to change this dimension between those lines. So I think the shell command is extremely useful. Okay. Now I'm going to turn my sketch back on, and I can select these two regions, I'll right click and say extrude, or you can hit the E key as the shortcut key. And I'm going to start to drag. Now, again, I could type in the dimension, or if I just click, you can notice as I'm going to hover over here, it's going to snap to that, okay? Or I could come in and say all, and you'll notice that's more for like cutting stuff away. And so it's saying tool body creation failed. So I've gotten this question before where it's like, well, can't you just say through all and it'll go here? Well, it doesn't know. It's trying to go to infinity basically, and it can't find anything to intersect with. So in this case, I like to click with distance, or I can say to object, and here I would have to select and rotate and grab that back face, right? Or I could have probed through. So it's really up to you. I usually keep it to distance, and I just hover and click, okay? Obviously we want to join that together, and now we have those little wings, I'm calling it in the outline. And then finally I've got this smaller rectangle. I want to remove that, so I'm gonna click here and say extrude. Again, just click on that back face, and you can see that it's gonna do a cut through there because it's overlapping geometry. I'll go ahead and say okay, turn off my sketch, and you can kind of see what we did there. Using just a basic sketch, you know, a couple circles and a couple rectangles, and then we used parts of that sketch to do a couple different extrudes. Okay, I want to chamfer these, you can kind of see right here. We've got these little edges right there, and I detail them out, 0.05 chamfer on those edges. So I'm going to do that. Now, a couple different ways I could do this. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this edge here and say chamfer. Now I could type it in because that's what the drawing says, okay? Or let's pretend maybe it wasn't on the drawing and I just wanted to change this face to be sloped. So check this out. I'm gonna right click and say chamfer. And then I'm gonna click on this little down arrow and say measure. And what that's gonna allow me to do is to pick on an edge, and it's going to measure that edge and put that into the distance. And that's how I actually came up with a 0.05. Instead of having to guess or type multiple different numbers like 0.03, 0.04, 0.05, you know, you can just measure that existing edge. And I'm going to go ahead and select all 4 of those. Okay. I'll say okay, and there we go. We've quickly chamfered those. And I could always come back and edit that in the timeline if I wanted to. The next thing I want to do is I want to create these holes. And I think I realized I didn't dimension them. So I'm going to have to update the drawing. I apologize. They are in the outline. They're 0.1 diameter, but I should have put those in the... yeah, this actually drawing needs a lot of work. I apologize. I need to locate where they're at. So follow the outline and not the drawing. I will update that and re-upload it into the description. So maybe wait a couple hours after this live stream and I will update that drawing. I apologize, guys. Okay, I want to create a hole. I personally like to use the hole command, which you can see here is in my shortcut right here at like about 4 o'clock. Okay, or it's in the create menu, hole, or the H shortcut key. Okay, now you'll notice it just puts it on the face randomly and it's really large. This is supposed to be 0.1 in diameter. Okay, now I want to put it in a certain location, and you'll notice as I kind of zoom up here and move around, you can see this black line appearing, and this is what we call our reference, and you can see it even says add reference. and you can see we have 2 references in the menu. Okay, so all I have to do, for example, is I'm going to click on this edge, and it's supposed to be 0.09, and so you see the circle kind of moved over a little bit. Okay, then I'm going to click, for example, on this top edge, and that is supposed to be 0.125. And you'll see now it's referencing this edge of 0.09 and referencing this edge of 0.125. And that's how I'm able to kind of position where I want that circle to be without having to use like a sketch or projected geometry or anything. Okay. Now I want it to go all the way through as a simple hole. It's just it's not even tapped or anything like that. So I'll keep it simple. And I want it to go all the way through. Now, by default, it looks like it is, okay? But let's pretend that it wasn't. I'm gonna drag this back. Let's say maybe it came in looking something like this. Here I could come in and say, go through all. And it's gonna go all the way through the model correctly, okay? So I'll go ahead and say okay. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now, I could mirror, that's totally fine. This is really up to you. I could mirror this whole feature, or I could create another one. Again, it's up to you what you think is better. There's no right or wrong. In honesty, I'd probably mirror it just because that way if I change one, both of them change. But I'm going to go ahead and do that whole feature again just to kind of reiterate how it works. So in this case, I'm going to say whole, and you'll notice it's randomly on that face. I can grab that blue dot and move it around if I want to, but you'll notice it's not going to snap automatically to anything. If I get near an edge, you see it doesn't snap to that or whatever. So this is where that reference really comes into play. So again, I'll do that, and that's supposed to be the 0.09, and that edge there is the 0.125. And distance, I'm going to say go through all, and it's going to cut all the way through the model. Okay? And like I said, I would probably mirror that feature, but I just wanted to kind of show the power of the whole command. Okay, looking at the drawing, you can see that there's like a little notch that goes into this little hole region, and it's a 0.065 wide. So I'm gonna edit the sketch and use a basic rectangle to do that, to cut that geometry away. Now I could create a new sketch, but because this one sketch that I already have has a lot of the information already, I'm actually going to go all the way back in time, edit that sketch. Now we're at the very beginning, so that's why you don't see any 3D model or anything like that, but I'm going to go ahead and use this sketch and add some more complexity to it. So you've heard me say before, keep your sketches simple. And in this case we did, couple circles, couple rectangles, but now we're coming back and then just adding a little bit more to it, and we're going to use that downstream. It'll be pretty cool actually. So instead of having multiple sketches, we're going to kind of keep it to one sketch in this case. So I'm going to say rectangle. I love the centered rectangle, so all I have to do is get near this edge, and you can see it's snapping to that edge, and if I get near the mid, you'll see that it automatically snaps to the midpoint for me right there. And then I can type in the distance. So in this case, I'm going to say 0.125, and the overall height was 0.065. Okay. And you'll see how it's fully defined. It's constrained to the midpoint, so the line is black. I'll do the exact same thing on this other side. Now, I get asked, well, couldn't you just mirror that? And the answer is yes, I could, but I have to have a mirror line. And so I'd have to spend the time drawing a line, changing it to construction geometry, etc. where maybe I just want to draw a rectangle and I don't care what size it is, like so. And then I can come in and say equal. I want that edge and that edge to be equal. I want that edge and that edge to be equal. And you can see no matter what this dimension is over here, or these dimensions are, this one has to be equal to it. So if I made this, let me escape out of here. If I made that 0.1, you'll see that it will update, and so will this one over here, because they have to stay equal. So again, it's totally up to you whether you want to mirror or if you want to add constraints or whatever. I personally don't like to use mirror all that much because it adds a lot of extra constraint icons onto my sketch. I like doing mirror in 3D versus 2D. So, but again, it's totally up to you. So I'm going to say finish sketch. Now here's the cool thing. So we just went way back in time and edited that sketch. And when I said finish sketch, it came forward in time and did all of the extrudes and the shells and the holes, etc. And you might be saying, well, how come it didn't punch those holes through? Well, because we didn't tell it to. For example, in this extrude, we told it to use these profiles. We didn't tell it to use these rectangles or anything like that. So it's kind of cool that you can go back in time and edit that sketch. Now I can turn it on. I'll go ahead and add in these profiles. Now I like to over exaggerate, so I'm going to grab even the stuff that's out in the air. Now you might be asking, well, do you have to? And the answer is no. But what if this face ended up being drafted 1 degree or something like that down the road? Well, then this would create a sliver face, So I like to do something like this. That way, even if this face changes, if it gets drafted a degree or whatever, we're obviously still going to be cutting through it. It's almost like this is a big cutting tool. Okay. Again, you could totally do it this way. It's up to you. But I like to make sure. Okay. So I'm going to say extrude. I could say this, in this case, I could say extrude all. And now because there was geometry that it was interfering with, it knows how far to go. Whereas before, when I tried to do it, it didn't know how far to go. And that's why it threw me that error. I'll turn my sketch off, and you can see we just kind of created those grooves through those holes. Okay, and I'm just following along my outline here. So the next thing I want to do is we've basically created the main shape, this little dog bone, whatever you want to call it. Then there's this added little area which on the model, I'm not exactly 100% sure what it's for. You can kind of see it here. So there's the 2 laser diodes, and then there's this, and I'm not sure if that's like a thermostat, so it's checking to see if the laser is getting too hot, and if it does, maybe it automatically shuts off, is my guess. But we're going to go ahead and create that geometry there. So let me put that down. Okay, so I'm going to draw this circle here, and we can see that it's 0.3 up and 0.3 over with 0.4 diameter. Okay, now I could go back and edit this original sketch, but now I'm kind of like, okay, I'm done with this area. Now I want to do this other area. So I'm going to create a new sketch. So I'm kind of breaking this down into like these subcomponents, and I just want this circle over here to kind of be by itself and not be part of the original. This is just a personal preference, not saying this is how you have to do it. So I'm going to come in here and say 0.4 for the diameter. I'll throw some dimensions on here, so I'll go from here. You can see it'll automatically catch to the center of that circle. I've shown this tip before. I'm just going to reiterate it. When I go to move my cursor, you'll notice my dimensions aligned or at the wrong angle or whatever. If you move around, you'll get it finally to go horizontal, or you'll get it to finally go vertical, but you kind of have to know where to go to make that happen. Well, if you have a hard time with that, just right mouse click and say, I want this to be a horizontal dimension. And now you'll notice no matter where I move, it has to be a horizontal dimension. So I'll say 0.3. I'll do the same thing again. Click those 2 points. And you can kind of see how moving around is going to give me different results or whatever. But if I right mouse click, I can say I want this to be a vertical dimension. And now no matter what, it's going to be a vertical dimension. So just, that might help you down the road. So I'm going to say 0.3 and 0.3. And we can see that it moved that circle into place. Okay? Okay. I'm going to leave it like that. Say Finish Sketch. Click on my profile here. Now I'm not going to select, all of these profiles. I don't need to. Okay, I'm just going to grab this outside one right here. I'll say Extrude and just click on that back face. And notice I haven't even had to rotate or even look at the back of this thing at all yet. Okay, and I'm going to join that together. So it's going to take that profile, join it to that model. Now I want to create the 0.25 hole that goes through there. Like I mentioned before, I really like the hole command, so I'm going to say hole, and notice it randomly put it on that face. Well, here's a cool trick. If I grab this blue dot and start to move around, notice all the little dots on the screen. Now obviously there's one right here that's in the center of this circle right here. There's also one down here. There's also a couple over here and all that kind of stuff. So if you already have the geometry existing, it's really easy to automatically catch to the center of that feature, basically. Again, not having to use a sketch to do that. It's 0.25 in diameter. I want it to go through all. So we can kind of see, sure enough. I'll say OK. And the other reason I like using the hole command is I can always come back, and in fact I could even click the face in the on the part itself, and it highlights which hole feature that was in my timeline just by clicking on the face. You can kind of see that. So I could always come back and edit this and say, okay, maybe 0.25 is too big. We want it to be 0.2, for example. And it's a very quick and easy way of changing that. I'm not going to, but you can kind of see why I like using the whole feature. Okay, let's take a look at our drawing. We've pretty much modeled all of this stuff here. We've got that extra little hole. The next thing is the ribs, or I guess the ribs on the heatsink. And this is where I'm going to share a couple neat little tips. Okay, let me jump back here. And I'm going to do this a couple different ways to kind of show you what you might experience. So, just like I said before, I kind of like to break this down into smaller subcomponents. So I want to create another sketch. So I'm actually going to click on that face and say Create Sketch. Could I have gone back to this sketch or even this sketch? Absolutely, I could have. Again, it's up to you, but I like to kind of keep my sketches defining which things I'm working on. So obviously this sketch is going to have to do with the ribs. So I'm going to start out by just drawing a rectangle out here somewhere. Okay, obviously I drew it too big and I drew it in the wrong spot. But like I've shown before, I like to dimension this. So I'm going to come in here and say for the total width, it's supposed to be 0.03. Okay, and for the total height, it's supposed to be 0.3. I know a lot of these numbers are pretty similar. Okay, now if I grab this, you'll see that it's going to stay the same shape. Now here's an interesting thing. You'll notice, let me just undo here real quick. I'm going to zoom up so you can kind of see what's going on. I'm going to drag this corner point, and if I get near this edge, it's really hard to see, but now there's a little X underneath it, and you can see as I'm moving, it's actually following the curve. So it's actually going to create a coincident constraint for me automatically. Okay? And if I hover over it, sure enough, we can see that coincident constraint that it created. Or I could come in here and say coincident, that point with that edge, and I get the same result. And you'll notice now I'm dragging that rectangle and it's following along. So my tip here is Fusion is going to try and create the correct constraint for you automatically, or you can force it. You can tell it, I want this to be a coincident constraint. So just kind of a heads up there, right? Okay, so I make that coincident with the circle, and then Jason showed this in his beginner sketching. I use this all the time. I want to center this, and if I were to come in here and let's try it the wrong way, I'm going to say midpoint. I want the middle of this line to be on the middle of this line here. You'll notice it can't. It won't let me. Failed to solve. Okay, so how do I get this to be perfectly lined up? Well, a quick shortcut is just draw a line from the center to the center of the circle. You can kind of see how it's snapping to the center of the circle. Okay. Then I usually turn this to a construction line because I don't want it to cut through my model. And then finally I click on horizontal vertical, and notice what it did. Okay. It still had to keep this point coincident on this edge, but then it brought it along until this line was perfectly vertical. So now I know that my rib is perfectly centered where it needs to be. Okay. I recommend rewatching that on the video if you haven't tried this out, but it's kind of a really cool trick. Like I mentioned, Jason showed it in his sketching last week. I use this all the time. I think he uses it all the time. I think he's the one that taught me how to do it, if I remember correctly. So, okay. So I finally got my profile where I want. I'm going to extrude this. Okay. How far? I'm just going to click. And notice it says join. Now, I'm going to do it the right way first, and then I'm going to come back and edit my timeline and do it the wrong way and show you why I'm doing it this way. I'm going to actually say new body. Okay? Not new component, not in this case. I'm going to just say new body because I want this body to be part of my heatsink component. I'm going to say okay, and now you'll notice I have this part and I have this part, and it's a separate body. And you'll see why here in just a moment. Okay. I also want to add some draft to this. Now, I talked a lot about the draft command in last week's live stream, so hopefully you're comfortable with it now. So I'm going to say draft, and I want these faces to kind of splay out. So my draft plane is going to be here because I want this edge to become a hinge, right? So that's what the draft plane means. You can kind of imagine there's a long piano hinge right there. So now if I select that face, and we add some draft to it, oops, I didn't select the other face, sorry. You'll see that it's hinging on that draft plane, okay? So that's what that draft plane means. Now, we're only gonna add about 1/2 degree of draft. We don't need a whole bunch here, but it is gonna splay it out just a little bit. If I look at it kind of from the front, you can kind of see that, how it's angled up. Okay. So I now have created my rib, and here's kind of where the magic happens. We're obviously gonna create a pattern, a circular pattern to make these ribs, but we're gonna wanna be able to not have all of them appear. So check this out. I'm gonna come under Create, Pattern, Circular Pattern. Now, by default, it's usually set to faces. I love to use features, but notice one of the options is bodies. Now, I could use features and select my extrude and my draft features, and that would work. But because we created this as a separate body, I can just say pattern that body right there. Okay. What's the axis? Well, the axis, I'm just going to click either on a cylindrical face or an edge. It doesn't matter. And you'll see I get a preview. And as I increase the quantity, the preview updates accordingly. Now, according to the drawing, there's 22 ribs. So I'm going to type in 22, and you'll see it creates quite a few ribs. And let's take a look at it from the front. Okay, so here's the cool thing I wanted to show you. Notice right here it says suppress, and it has a checkbox. And you'll notice that every single rib has a checkbox on it. And so I can click on any of those to unselect them. So I want to keep this one, but I don't want that one and that one. I don't want these two that I've already unselected, and I don't want that guy and that guy. So I still have 22 ribs going all the way around, but then I removed a couple of them. Okay? Think about how complex my sketch would have to be, to create this as a sketch and not have them here. I'm going to go ahead and do the pattern and then suppress some of them so they don't appear. When I say OK, here's the result. And notice I got a ton of bodies over here. Okay? Then all I have to do is combine. So I'm going to come in here and say combine. What's the target? That's the target. What's the tool? Well, I could select them individually, or I'm just going to draw a big box around all of them. I want to join them together, and you can even see the preview kind of shows the lines have gone away. When I say OK, we are now back to one body, and it kept the ribs that I wanted, and I was able to remove the ribs that I didn't want. Okay. Now, I'm going to step back quite a bit, and we're going to redo all those ribs, because some of you might be saying, well, couldn't you have just joined it and then patterned the feature? And the answer is yes, but watch what happens when I do that. Okay. So I'm going to undo. Actually, I don't even have to undo. Let me, well, yeah, I will. Let me undo back. Let me get rid of that guy. Sorry. Let me go to my extrude, and instead of saying new body, I'm going to say join. Actually, let me do it the right way. I'm going to step back. Okay. Instead of new body, I'm going to say join. And you'll notice when I say OK, it's joined that rib to the part. Okay. Then I'll come in and I'll add my draft. There's my draft. I don't know if you can see that. It's kind of cool. There it was before. There it is after. A little bit of draft. Okay. Now I'm not going to bring up this pattern. I'm going to recreate a new pattern. So let's go here and say pattern, circular pattern. Now obviously I don't want to do the body. So I'm going to come in here and say features. Because this is all one body, I don't want to pattern that, obviously, right? So I'm going to come in and say features, and I'm going to say I want to pattern the extrude feature and the draft feature. But notice what it's selected, okay? And when I start adding in, I'm getting kind of a weird preview, right? Well, that's because this rib was joined to this body. If I were to say OK, let me just do 5. If I were to say OK, you'll notice it does it correctly, but the preview is pretty darn confusing. In fact, watch what happens when we get to 22. Okay? And it's difficult to see which ribs do we want to turn on or off and stuff like that. So this is the exact reason, even though it's really pretty, this is the exact reason why instead of joining the rib, I ended up doing it as a separate body, and then patterning it, and then combining it together. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense there. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that guy. Let's edit this guy again and make it a new body. And I should be able to step to the end, and there we go. Okay, so quick review. When I did the extrude, we kept it as a separate body. I was able to add draft. I was able to pattern the body. Okay, I was able to suppress, and I get a really nice preview what that looks like. And then I did the combine to join them all into one body. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And the only reason I'm showing this is because, you know, I ran into this when I was reverse engineering this model. So you might run into something similar, and hopefully these little tips and tricks will help you down the road. Okay, finishing up here, I'm going to click fillet on that guy and do a 0.02. And I must talk too much because I notice we're almost near the top of the hour. So I'm just going to go ahead and fillet those guys. I want to make sure I show the gears. So we are going to go a little bit long, which I do appreciate. Everybody says, we don't care if you go long. So again, you can always rewatch on the YouTube channel later on. Okay, the last thing I want to do is there's a hole, and man, this drawing is awful. I apologize. I must have missed a lot of dimensions or missed a version or something. So again, I will update the drawing. Follow the outline. So I'm going to create a sketch on here. Now, in this case, I'm not going to use the whole command. And the main reason for that is the whole command doesn't like to be out in the open like this. It likes to be on a face, and I don't really have anything to reference. So I'm going to use just a regular circle command. So I'll say circle, and I'm going to purposely draw it in the wrong spot, and 0.1 in diameter. I'll throw some dimensions on here. So I'm going to grab that guy, and it's supposed to be 0.5 from the edge. And then I want it to be in line with this origin. So again, that horizontal vertical is extremely useful because it forces those to stay horizontal. I can see that it's fully constrained. I can now click on this profile here and extrude through. Okay, so I could do to that face, or I could say all. And it'll extrude all the way through the model. And there we go. Okay, the last thing I tell you to do in the outline is to add an appearance. So I hit the A key on my keyboard. I'm going to go into metal. Under aluminum, there's one called bead blasted. And this aluminum kind of looks like it's bead blasted. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag that on there. It doesn't look like it did much, but if I zoom up, you'll actually see that there is a bead blasted texture on there, and it just adds that little bit of realism, and we can kind of see that that's made out of bead blasted aluminum. Okay, not a complex part, but I wanted to show some tips with the patterns, that kind of stuff. So now we're going to do the gears, and the gears are not that complicated. And I did see a comment before we started. Somebody said, oh, gears are very difficult. And Jason actually answered, or somebody else, I think it was actually another viewer answered, there's some plugins. And that's exactly what I'm going to be showing here. There's some really cool plugins out there that will speed up the process for you. So I'm going to show that live. Let me switch back. I'm going to create a new design. And there's two different gears, and they are slightly different from each other. But they're pretty similar. So I'm going to start with this drive gear. And the reason for this is you'll notice there's this little square boss that actually connects into a shaft that rotates the, or actually is connected to the stepper motor. Now you'll notice I have an image here with lots of information. And it says FM Gears. This is the actual app that we're going to be using, and I'll show you how I went about doing this. But it actually creates the complex tooth profile for you automatically. All you need to know is like what's the pitch diameter, the hole diameter, and you can see you can fill these in, how many teeth, thickness of the gear, etc. So we're going to use that to kind of get the basic shape, and then we'll just add some extra stuff onto it. Okay, so where do you get this FM gear? I'm in a new session. I'm going to create a new component, and I'll just call this gear. Let's call it drive gear. I'll say okay. There we go. Okay. If I go into this Tools tab right here, there's a section called Add-ins, and you'll see it says Scripts and Add-ins, and then Fusion 360 App Store. I'm going to click on that App Store, and of course it's going to bring it up. Okay, good. It brought it up in the right window. This is our Fusion 360 App Store, and you'll notice that there's some featured apps like Slicer, Bomber, etc., helical gear generator. Well, I'm going to just come in here and search for gear and hit enter, and you'll see there's a bunch of different ones: bevel gear design, spur gear, helical gear, rack gears, etc. Then there's this FM gears. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that guy, and it gives you a description. It talks about what it can do, what people think about it, reviews, etc. And then I can come in here and specify which OS. Sometimes it'll say Mac, sometimes it'll say PC, and then I just hit download, and it'll probably ask me to log in. I'll go ahead and say next and sign in using your Autodesk ID. And you'll see that it's going to download that, and I just ran it and it installed it. I didn't have to do anything special or spectacular. Okay. Then I go back into Fusion under my tools, scripts and add-ins. Now you'll notice we already have like spur gear in there, but I'm going to go to this add-ins, and there it is, FM gears. Okay, here's another one I use all the time, parameter IO. Okay, the Veroni sketch generator, etc. So this is where they usually show up. So if you click on FM gears, mine's already running, but let's just say stop. You might have to hit this run, and you'll also notice you can have it run on startup, so you don't have to remember to do this every single time. So I'm going to go ahead and say run, and it says the FM gears command has been added to the create panel of the model workspace. Okay. So I'm in my design workspace, create, and right here, FM gears. So if anybody writes a plugin or an add-in or something, you can add them into Fusion very easily. And there's more than just gears. There's like dog bone creators for your sketch if you're having parts fit together. I mean, there's a ton of stuff out there. I recommend taking a look at that. Okay, so here's the FM gears. And I could make this a little bit bigger. The image kind of talks about what it's expecting. And you can see like this blue line or purple line is your pitch diameter, etc. I've already provided the information. I just basically reverse engineered the gears that came in this laser projector. So the hole diameter is 0.05. It's a very small hole. Pressure angle is 20. The diametral pitch is going to be, you can kind of see that right here. That's going to be 26. And the number of teeth is going to be 24. I left the root fillet radius. That's kind of like what this is right here. It's kind of hard to see. And then gear thickness is 0.17. Now watch what happens when I say okay. It's going to think for a little bit. You see it create a sketch, and then it extruded that. In fact, it created its own component. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of mine. We don't need that one in there. I'm going to make this one active. So it created its own component. I forgot that it was going to do that. Okay. And if we take a look at this, we can see, sure enough, it's 26 teeth. Here's that size that we were talking about, the radius, etc. I did not have to draw a sketch. Here's the 0.05 hole diameter through the part. Okay. And again, this is all listed right here. This is what I use to type in those numbers. Okay, using the rest of the drawing, I'm going to create these little standoffs, this little indentation, and these holes. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is basically, now that I got the gear the way I want it, I'll just create a new sketch. Again, I'm making sure that my component is active. I can see all the sketches that were used to create it, and now my new sketch. And then I can add in some extra geometry. So I'm going to throw in a circle that's 0.422 in diameter. Okay. I'm going to offset that in. So what's the sketch curve? I'll go ahead and, oops, Fusion's thinking. Hopefully it's not auto-saving. Wow. Give me just a second, guys. There we go. Okay. The joys of pushing a lot of data over on stream. Okay. It's asking for an offset, and I'm going to type in minus 0.05. Okay. And, oh man, I'm getting a lot of lag. I'm going to save just in case. I don't know if, hopefully my son is not streaming videos or anything like that. So I'm going to do an offset. In fact, I'm going to save real quick. Give me a second here, guys. Wait. Save. I'm just going to call this drive gear. Okay. Oops, and it accepted my offset. So I'm going to type in minus 0.05. Now I could have typed in, diameter 0.422 and then figured out the math and made another circle, but I like to use the offset command because it allows you to specify a distance. And I'm just going to say it's a wall thickness of 0.05. Then I'll do a rectangle, center rectangle here. And this is supposed to be 0.12 by 0.12. It's just a square rectangle. I can select those two profiles and say extrude. Let's just do a 0.15 for the extrude. You can kind of see how easy this is, and we're going to join that to the existing gear. The hole still goes all the way through. It's pretty much done with the front of the gear. Now I want to work on the back of the gear, so I'm going to select the face, right click, and say create sketch. And now we're sketching on the back of the gear. Okay, so you can kind of see how the sketch is on the back. Again, just using information from the drawing and all this information. I know the gear drawings are good. Okay, so this is supposed to be 0.7 in diameter. And then I'm going to draw another circle over here somewhere. And let's just make this 0.06. Okay. And like I've shown before, I always over-exaggerate. I draw it not where it's supposed to be. And that way when I come in and I start constraining it, I can verify and visually see that things are happening correctly. So 0.3 over, and then I want that to be horizontal with that, and I can see it kind of jump down into place, and it's perfectly lined up and it's fully constrained. Okay, this next tip I actually just learned. I answered a question out on the forum, and somebody was asking like, how would they mirror something from an upper right corner to the lower left corner of like a rectangle? And I was like, man, I wish I could use like pattern to do that, but I ended up doing mirrors and stuff, and somebody says, oh, you can use pattern, just do a quantity of 2. So I could mirror this circle, but instead I'm just going to come in here and do a circular pattern. What's the object? That guy. Center point is already there. I didn't have to draw any extra geometry, and instead of a quantity of 3, I'm going to say a quantity of 2, and you can kind of see it's almost like it mirrored it to the other side. So I thought this was a really cool tip, And this is a simple example. Theirs was going from one corner of a rectangle to the other. But I just thought this was a neat tip. Okay, so I'm going to extrude this profile into the part. Now you'll notice I didn't select these circles. I could have, but you'll notice it's not necessary in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and specify the distance according to the drawing is supposed to be 0.1. So I'm going to say minus 0.1. I'll say OK. And I'm left with something that looks like this. I'll turn that sketch back on, and this time I'll select these profiles, say extrude, and as I start to extrude, you'll notice it's basically machining them away. In fact, it's going to go all the way through. I'm going to just pick on that bottom face, say OK, and I'm now left with something that looks like this. So we used the plugin to create the gear, and then we just modified that to add some extra geometry to it. I'll go ahead and turn off that last sketch, and I'm going to add an appearance. And in this case, these are made out of nylon. So I'm going to switch to my plastic, and here's that nylon 6/6. I'm just going to drag that onto there, and now it's made from that material. Now this is just an appearance. Let me show this. I'm going to go to the Create menu. Let's see if I want to, Modify menu. We have appearance and we have physical material. If I wanted to simulate like how much this thing is going to weigh, what's the mass properties and stuff like that, I would definitely want to make sure to use physical material. And it looks almost exactly the same. I could come in here and say plastic, but you'll notice I've got a bunch of different plastics in here, okay? And then I can drag and drop that on there, and it's going to apply not only the appearance, but it's also going to apply all of the mass properties of that particular body. So if I were to come in here and go to properties, we can see the appearance and the physical material, how much it's going to weigh, what's the total area, etc. Where's the center of mass, etc., etc. So make sure if you're curious about all the, the mass properties, make sure you're using the physical material. Okay. Moving on to the next gear, I'm going to go a little bit faster, but there's an interesting thing I wanted to show in this one, which are these little slots that kind of go through, like how do we create those? So I'm going to, again, use this information that you see here to create the gear. It is slightly smaller than the last gear, but then I'm going to focus on the creating those slots because there's some kind of cool tips and tricks with that. And it shouldn't take very long, okay? So, new design, and I'm going to go to my Create FM Gears. Now this time I'm going to change, this is going to be 0.32, so it's going to be a much larger hole going through that. Pressure angle is 20. Now you'll notice this pitch diameter. Watch what happens to this pitch diameter as I go through and edit some of these numbers. You'll see that it actually updates automatically. So this is going to be 26.5, and sure enough you can see that pitch diameter changed. Number of teeth is going to be 23 in this case. You can kind of see that. And the thickness is 0.17. I'll say OK. And notice, for example, in this case, the hole is much larger coming through. Okay? And it's a smaller diameter. Now, I want to make sure I'm going to activate that component. Otherwise, everything's going to be at my top level. So I'm going to go ahead and say activate that component. I'll expand it open. I like doing that. Okay. And then let's just quickly create a sketch. A circle here. Notice lots of comments and questions in the Q&A. So Jason, thanks for helping answer all of those. Hopefully everything's making sense for everybody. I'm going to do a 0.422 circle here and extrude that profile 0.15, just like we did on the last one. Okay. And then the next section is working on the back of the design. And this is where we're going to create those slots. So I'm going to click that face, create sketch. And again, using this drawing here, so you can see I gave some dimensions. They're 0.1 up and 0.1 down. And in the, I need to give the width. Again, it's in the outline. I must be really bad at creating drawings. I apologize. So I'm going to create a circle. And it's going to be 0.685. And I will update those drawings. Okay. Then I'm going to create another circle, 0.6. But this is what we're going to kind of use as a reference. I'm going to click on it and change it to a construction circle. Okay, I don't want it to be an object. Okay, and we're going to use this construction circle to create a slot. Now, we don't have a squared off slot, but we do have these arc slots, which are really cool. And I'm going to use the center point arc slot. Okay. So the first thing it's asking for is select center point of arc. So I'm going to click here. And then I'm going to go ahead and click somewhere on this circle there. And then somewhere over here. And then finally, when I move, you can kind of see what's happening. Okay. Well, I'm actually going to click on that line, or that circle, I should say. And I just created this curved slot. Now, I didn't do any dimensions. It didn't really ask for any dimensions. It was all just kind of clicking around. Now, I want to make sure everything is good. You'll notice I can come in and say, I want this point to be coincident with that circle. Let me make sure I did that. Sure enough, I did. And you'll notice how this arc is now black. This arc, it's kind of hard to see, is also black. So I've constrained this slot to the edge of that circle. Now I need to add some dimensions in here. So I know from here to here is 0.1. And we can see that that turned black. And I'll say from here to here, I want that to be the same, so I'm just going to click on that existing dimension and hit enter. And I got a different result, which is not what I expected. So let me undo. I wonder why that 0.1. Yeah, that's, I'm not sure why it's doing that. So I'm going to type in 0.1. Wow. It might be because of the tangent thing. So let me delete this. Again, live, everything's live. I'm gonna bring that up like so, and let's see if that makes a difference. So I'll go in here, go in there, and say 0.1. Yeah, okay. So it happens to all of us, right? So what I ended up doing is I was getting some weird result. I don't know why. It almost looked like it was measuring off the right side of the circle. So I just stepped back a little bit and forced a change and then threw that dimension back in there, and that seemed to fix it. So, okay, now I got that the way I want. The last thing I'm going to do is I want to square these off. So I'm just going to get near this arc right here, and then you'll see it kind of snap automatically and then snap automatically. It's kind of hard to see because of the gray background, but it's catching to the end of this arc and catching to the end of that arc. So all I have to do is get close, and now you can see I'm left with this squared off curved region. So yeah, it took me a little bit of time to create the slot, but think about how fast this would be doing it this way. So I'll go ahead and say finish sketch. Let's extrude that through. So I'm going to just kind of start to extrude, click on that back face like so. Okay. Then I might come in and create a circular pattern. Feature, I'll use that extrude feature. What's my axis? I can either click on that or maybe the center axis through here. And then again, I'll do a quantity of 2 and I get that particular shape there. And then finally, I'll turn my sketch back on. And I want to make sure I'm extruding all of this down. I think it's minus 0.1 in this case, so minus 0.1. And I'll say OK. Let's turn off our sketch. Now, you might run into this. Now, you'll notice that there's these edges right here. Now, I could leave those. That's totally fine. I could also click on that face and hit the delete key, and notice that it basically healed that region. Now, the only thing I can think of is that, you know, the curve of the circle and the curve of the slot were just ever so slightly different, maybe. And so mathematically they didn't match up, so it left that face. But by clicking on that face and selecting delete, it has to, let me move this over just a little bit. It has to heal. So this face over here has to join up with this face over here. So when I say delete, you'll see it basically heals itself. So you could just delete those extra faces if it happens at all. And then lastly, appearance. We'll do that nylon again, and we are done with our 2 gears. And if I switch back to the camera here, and it's kind of hard to see, but here's those gears that we just created, right? And then here's that drive gear, kind of small, but hopefully you can kind of see that, the small hole going through the center, etc. So, okay. I covered multiple parts. We did the heatsink. We did a couple different kinds of gears using that FM gear plugin. Hopefully you found this beneficial. Make sure you thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs up if you didn't. Next week, I think I'm gonna be doing the circuit board. I have to figure, and the wiring. We'll figure that part out. Again, make sure you go out to our Fusion 360 Live YouTube channel and see all of the live streams that are happening, and sign up for those if you haven't already, or make sure you're online for those. Want to thank Jason for helping out, and hope to see you on our next live stream. Thank you.